Welcome to the virtual introduction Sunday school class on Matthew. Ordinarily, you'd be seeing pictures of class participants, but somebody forgot to push the record button, and I think it might have been me. So I'm going to be cutting again a recording of what I hope I said in the class, and we'll review Matthew that way. Matthew is one of the Synoptic Gospels, which means that it sees similarly. That's what syn means, similar, and optic means seen. It looks at the ministry of Jesus in a very similar way to Mark and Luke, but also it has its distinctives and different emphases and different audiences which are addressed. I'll start the screen share if I can here, and we'll see if we can get that to help us with understanding this. Okay. You can see that Luke and Matthew both call upon Mark. Matthew actually somewhat more, and they follow Mark's chain of events in Jesus' ministry, and sometimes do that verbatim. But there are distinctives. The Last Judgment, the Sermon on the Mount are distinctive to Matthew, as are many others. And of course, the Good Samaritan and the Prodigal Son are distinctive to Luke. But there are also some verses, a number of them, as a matter of fact, 250, that Matthew and Luke have in common, but are not shared by Mark. So it looks as if there might have been another source, common source, which Matthew and Luke worked off of. And that common source has a number of very significant passages. For example, the Golden Rule, the Lord's Prayer. It has a number of parables which are of interest. The lost sheep and the wise and foolish builders, that's the rock and the sand parable. So it's obviously an important source for both Matthew and Luke. And this theory that there was a second source, this is called the two source theories of the Synoptic Gospel, was developed by a theologian who simply called this unknown source. But he was a German theologian, and so in German, the word for source is Quelle, and so we have shortened that to Q. And you may have heard of the Q source for the Synoptics. But we can look at the distinctives of Matthew and Luke, how they've massaged Mark and Q and added additional material to get an idea of what they wanted to emphasize. And in terms of Matthew, one of the things that he wants to emphasize is how the ministry of Jesus was in fulfillment of Jewish anticipations, prophecies, and dreams and wishes, that God would come and intervene in history and to establish a new reality. And we know that Matthew is addressing a Hebrew audience, in part because he starts his genealogy with Abraham. Now Luke, who's looking to create the impression that Christianity is a worldwide religion for all people, not just Jewish people, he starts with Adam. But Matthew starts with Abraham, and to show how that history develops and culminates in Jesus' ministry. And we see many references that Matthew, and Matthew alone, makes to Old Testament prophecy, which points to the fulfillment of Jesus, of those prophecies. In the class, when we had that, why each one of the class members took one of these passages and told us what the context of the passage was, and I'd read the passage. So let me see if I can do that by myself. The first passage, 1:22 through 23, is the virgin birth, and quoted is Isaiah. All this took place to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel, which means God with us. The next verse is the flight to Egypt, and Mark quotes Hosea. This was to fulfill what is spoken by the Lord through the prophet, out of Egypt I have called my son. So we have the family going down to Egypt, and sure enough, that's what Hosea said might happen. And then there's the massacre of the incidents, that tragic story in 2:17 through 18, and Jeremiah is quoted by Matthew. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled because they were no more. The next passage deals with Jesus dwelling in Nazareth, and Isaiah is quoted by Matthew. There he made his home in a town called Nazareth, so that what had been spoken through the prophets might be fulfilled. He will be called a Nazarene. The next verse is Jesus moving to Capernaum, a particular area of the northern part of Israel, and Matthew quotes Isaiah. So that what had been spoken through the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. Land of Zebulun, land of Naphtali, on the road by the sea across the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles, the people who sat in darkness have seen a great light, and for those who sat in the region and shadow of death, light has dawned. In reference to the healing ministry of Jesus, Matthew quotes Isaiah. This was to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet Isaiah. Look, he took our infirmities and bore our diseases. And again, on the healing ministry of Jesus. This was to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet Isaiah. Here is my servant whom I have chosen, my beloved, with whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon him, and he will proclaim justice to the Gentiles. He will not wrangle or cry aloud, nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. He will not break a bruised reed or quench a smoldering wick until he brings justice to victory, and in his name the Gentiles will hope. And that gives you a good idea of how often Matthew quotes Old Testament verses as a way of weaving the story of Jesus into the Hebrew story and show that it's the culmination of that history. There is another one which I've kind of saved for spatial attention, because I think it refers back to some of the points I made in the first class that we held on the Bible, and also because I think it's kind of clever. This is the story of Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. In Mark, it says that when they were approaching Jerusalem at Bethphage and Bethany near the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent two disciples and said to them to go ahead and to a village ahead of you, and immediately as you enter it, you will find there a colt that has never been ridden. Untie it and bring it. Then they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their cloaks on it, and he sat on it, the colt. Colt. In Luke, it's essentially the same story. Jesus sends the disciples ahead, and then the disciples bring this colt to Jesus, and they throw their cloaks on the colt and set Jesus on that animal. But in Matthew, it's different. In Matthew, Jesus sends two disciples, saying, go to the village ahead of you, and immediately you'll find a donkey tied and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. And then he quotes the prophecy that's fulfilled, as Matthew understands it, with this occurrence. This is to fulfill what the prophet said, tell the daughter of Zion, look, your king is coming to you humble and mounted on a donkey, and on a colt, the foal of a donkey. So we got two animals. And then according to Matthew, the disciples went and did as Jesus had directed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and put their cloaks on them, and he sat on them. Now that's an odd image of Jesus sitting on two animals. Maybe he alternated, but it's important for Matthew to have two animals. So why is that? Well, it comes from the quotation from Zechariah. But Zechariah's prophecy is not prose, it is poetry. And in Hebrew poetry, they rhyme a poem not by sound, like I think I'll never see a poem lovely as a tree. They rhyme it by meaning. So they will restate something as the rhyme. So for example, in Matthew 27:1, the Lord is my light and my salvation, whom shall I fear? And then the rhyme to that is, The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? Now you see, they're both the same thing being expressed, but in different phraseology. So they rhyme, A-B. Well, in Zechariah, we have A-B-C, A-B. It's a poem. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. That's A-B rhyme. Then there's C phrase. Lo, the king comes before you, triumphant and victorious to see. Then we have another A-B rhyme. Humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. So it's not meant to refer literally to two animals, but it's a poem. Well, in the first lecture or class that we had on the meaning of the Bible, I warned against what I call category mistakes. That is, the Bible presents truth in a whole bunch of different ways. Metaphor and simile and parables and history and all that kind of thing. Well, what has happened here is Matthew has taken poetry to be history, to take it literally. And so that's why he has two animals involved. But it reminds us of how intense Matthew was to show that Jesus, to this Hebrew audience that he is addressing, was a fulfillment of their hopes and dreams. Now, another theme that Matthew has that's very significant is the importance of Christian community. We get a hint of that when we look at Matthew 18:20, when Jesus says, for where two or three are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them. That's a communal concept. Jesus is there when there is a group of people gathered. And frankly, the importance of community, or at least having some other people with us in our faith walk, is something we've all experienced. We've had other people who've been particularly significant to us, an expanded community for us. The church has often been very significant to us, small groups, study groups, all those occurrences in which we have gathered with people who have encouraged us and shared their faith with us. Those are times that we've really experienced, in sometimes the most powerful ways, the presence of the Spirit. Now, obviously, we do that individually as prayer, but that communal presence of Christ has an identity that is particularly powerful. And Matthew wants to emphasize the importance of that community, as did Jesus, as what he quotes. We got an echo of this in the Great Commission when Jesus says, I'm going to be with you always, as he sends out the disciples into the world to make disciples of all nations. Well, he's addressing a group of disciples, 11 of them. And so it is a comment of his presence to a group. Now, they obviously went out individually to do their ministry, but I suspect they were kind of like Paul. They brought along some people with them so that they could be encouraged by a larger group. And what we know of the way that the church expanded, it was because of these teams of people that went out to minister. But the clearest indication of Matthew's, the importance he gives on the church or community, comes from the two times in the Gospels, these are the only two times, that the word ecclesia, which means, this is the Greek word for church, is used. And Matthew is the one that uses them on both occasions. In the first is Matthew 18, and he's talking about what to do when a conflict arises among a group of believers. And he says, if another member of the church sins against you, go and point out the fault when the two of you are alone. If the member listens to you, you have regained that one. But if you are not listened to, take one or two others along with you, so that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of two or three witnesses. If the member refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if the offender refuses to listen even to the church, let such be one to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Well, this is a rather detailed description of how the church should deal with conflict. And this arises in the mid-latter part of the first century. Matthew's written probably 80, 90, something like that AD. And already the church is gathered together, a community of believers, and probably has some conflict because, individuals don't always agree eye to eye. And Matthew wants to be sure that they're dealing with that effectively. So the church is already there. It's on Matthew's mind, and he wants it to operate effectively. But the most powerful use of that word ecclesia, the church, comes in the confession of Peter when Jesus asked the disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And this is found in Matthew 16. Jesus said to them, the disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And Simon answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Now that is not underlined because that is also found in Luke and in Mark. Nothing new about that in terms of the Gospels. What is new, according to Matthew, is what follows. And Jesus answered them, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah. For flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, Petros, which means rock. And on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. And whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Now, to get a sense of the importance of this in the life of the development of the Christian church, I want to show you this symbol. This is the papal emblem, the coat of arms, if you will, of the Pope. Notice the two keys. It picks up on this notion that it is the church, or Peter, and the Pope stands in direct lineage of Peter. Peter is kind of the first Pope, who is the rock on which this church is built and has the keys. And the church holds those keys to understanding and obeying God's will. And so it centers around the community of faith as the primary way by which we experience the presence and power of God. Now, in order to understand the importance of that, I just want to drop back again to the first class that we had. In the Hebrew understanding, the primary responsibility humans had was to obey the law of God. And this was a matter of free choice. We either choose to be obedient or we choose to rebel. If we choose to be obedient, good things happen. Otherwise, bad things happen. So choose life. And what is wrong with the world is that we do not exercise that God-given ability of choice well. In the Christian understanding, too much credit is given to the ability of human beings to exercise that power. Our wills are generally pretty weak. And I had a college fraternity guy who told me, I can resist anything except temptation. Well, so it seems to be that way sometimes. And that was certainly the case with Paul. Paul said, "I can will what is right, but I cannot do it. Who will rescue me from this body of death?" And then he says, "Thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ." And Paul found that victory by opening his life to the spirit of the risen Christ so that he dwelt in Christ. And it's that transformation that Christ brought to him in his ability to follow God. Here's a little image using a life preserver. We need to be saved by a power beyond ourselves, which is God's action, or grace, which is the unmerited beneficence of God, working in our lives. It is God that we say yes to, who really is responsible for our transformation. Well, how do we say yes to that? Well, obviously, through our own decision to turn and seek God in a variety of ways. But in the early church understanding, the primary way by which we encountered God and were supported by God and were encouraged by God is the place where two or more gather and Jesus is present, which is the church. That is the church that offers this life saver. And Martha and I, and in the course of our ministry, have discovered that if people don't stay connected to the church, they quickly lose their enthusiasm or focus on the faith. There needs to be some kind of communal support to keep that alive, or there are just simply too many other temptations that draw us away from being obedient. So we need a group of people to root us on. And that's where we encounter, in the early understanding of the church, the presence most powerfully of the Spirit of God that transforms us. And there's some specific things that the church does. The sacrament, for example, it is figuratively and literally in the Catholic Church a way of taking into oneself the body of Christ and the energy that comes from that act. The teachings of the church that guide us and direct us. The church makes use of the wisdom of this larger community of faith over the centuries, so that we aren't just looking through our own little narrow blinders, but we're looking at the eyes of faith of the millennia. And it's the teachings of the church which guide and direct us, that rich resource of community. And it's the priesthood, those people who represent the presence of Christ. And unfortunately, Catholic Church holds that the only people that could represent the male Jesus are male people. Well, that's kind of a restricted understanding, in my opinion, of the presence of the risen Christ. But nevertheless, it's the priests that are the ones that stand there as a representative of Jesus, hearing our confessions, requiring of us signs of intent and purpose, and in what we might have to do to show our remorse, and then proclaiming forgiveness. So it's the sacraments, it's the priesthood, it's the teachings. All of this come from the church, which means that there really is no salvation outside of the church. The church is primary in that way of understanding. Now later on, the Protestant Reformation, three things will be replacing those other three on the Catholic side, preaching the Bible and all believers. But that's my course on church history, and we're not going to do that today. Going back to the Gospel of Matthew, then, you can see why it's often called the church gospel or the church book, because it is concerned about building up the organization and the health of the community. Now, another theme, which is not nearly as pleasant, and it's just something which pushes my buttons, so I get to present it to you, is that if you are really into weeping and gnashing of teeth, then Matthew's the gospel for you. Because Matthew is kind of into showing what the results are of people that are if people don't follow Christ. And weeping and gnashing of teeth happens when people go down to Hades, or cast into hell, actually. That phrase, it appears not at all in Mark. It appears once in Luke, but it appears 6 times in Matthew. And that's often in conjunction with the image of fire, or the phrase, the fire never goes out. And fires of hell are referred to in Luke 1 time, in Mark twice, but then 7 times in Matthew. And often that is the phrase, the fire that never goes out, and the worm that never dies. Now it is one thing to say that the fires are eternal. Seems to me it's another thing to say that a person goes into the fire eternally. And the phrase eternal punishment, which refers to the latter, occurs only once. And that again is in Matthew. And that's at the end of Matthew 25. But in that particular case, it's the whole nation, it's nations which are thrown into the fire, not just individuals, but that notion of eternal punishment, which is a dismal concept in my opinion, that God would create us to torture forever, particularly since our understanding of God is unconditional love, and how do you put that together? But that is a concept that appears, that seems to be more emphasized in Matthew than the other Gospels. Well, at this juncture, we took a break. Well, we didn't take a break. We transformed into an exercise. And this was an exercise from the Disciple Bible Study, which some of you hopefully are considering taking. It's a wonderful experience, transformational actually. And this exercise involved looking at Matthew 21 through 16, which is the parable of the servants that come and work at different times during the course of the day. And they're all paid the same at the end of the day, no matter how much they worked, which has given some people pause. But the exercise was to have that read aloud in the small breakout group, to ponder that individually, and then to share responses to these three questions. What does this passage say about God? What does this passage tell us about human beings? And what does this passage tell us about the relationship between God and human beings? Those three questions are questions that are often asked in the course of the Disciple Bible study itself, because they proven to be fruitful questions. And particularly so in this passage, because people react to that reality of same payment for different amounts of work in different ways. So you might consider that parable that comes from Matthew, and what it might be saying about God and what it might be saying about us, and also the relationship between us and God. After about 15 minutes or so of pondering that, we got back together, shared a few observations, and then we concluded. I welcomed them next week to the study of John. John is definitely not a synoptic gospel. It doesn't see things at all similarly to Matthew, Mark, and Luke in terms of Jesus' ministry and what he did and how he went about it. Huge differences in that very different gospel. And I'm going to suggest what some of those differences are, and also what might be some of the reasons behind those. So that will happen next week, and hope you'll be able to join the class if I poke the record button. Have a blessed week. Bye-bye.